It occurred to me on this fifth day of Advent that despair precedes hope. Boethius, in his Consolation of Philosophy, wrote, "To the young, death is a threat to their pleasures. But now that I am worn out and old, it offers at last a remission of all my pains. It is cruel, paying heed to my imploring pain, and will design to close my weeping eyes. In my flourishing days I was rich and whimsical, and fortune smiled, but for a little while she was carried away. That faithless face of hers has departed from my life." Boethius in his prison was in despair. He was crying out for some hope. Hope is, again, that which we all long for, that which we all need and we desire. I talked about Adam and Eve yesterday in the Garden of Eden, when they were in the flush of all joy and happiness, when they had all the pleasures that God could offer, all the delight, all the purpose, all the meaning. And then they succumbed to that one desperate temptation, and they were seduced by the serpent. He was their enemy, the enemy of their souls, when all they had to do was resist him to lay hold of and in fact maintain the hope that they had. Yet they plunged into despair and plunged all of humanity with them. Romans 8 says in that same chapter I was reading from yesterday, "For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope, that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to the corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God." Paul the Apostle goes on to say, "For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves, who had the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly." Do you ever feel yourself groaning, wrestling in your spirit for something to uplift your soul, something to increase your hope? Yes, Paul recognized that in his own personal experience. We all recognize that despair, like the serpent or like the darkness and shadows of the prison that Boethius was captivated into, is crouching at the door at every moment to invade our soul. And it's all we can do sometimes to keep it out, to keep it at bay. But Paul goes on to say, "For in this hope we were saved." Now, hope that is seen is not hope, for who hopes for what he has seen? But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. Likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness, for we do not know what to pray for as we ought, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. Just as Boethius was reaching out, and finally he encountered Lady Philosophy, who entered in, who explained to him that he does not need the comforts of life and the successes and the prestige and the wealth that is attainable for some people sometimes. He can look into his soul, into a higher source for the hope and for the joy. And that's what we as Christians do. And if you're not a Christian, I implore you, I urge you to look to God, the Almighty Father in heaven, who is the giver of all good things, it says in the book of James. Every good and perfect gift comes down from the Father of lights, in whom there is no variation. I think back again to Adam and Eve, who really were the progenitors of the despair that so many of us experience. What happened to them when they resisted God, when they decided that Satan was telling them the truth and that God was lying? Why, they were confronted. Immediately, they experienced their own nakedness. They experienced guilt. and they experienced shame. And all those things contributed to their first ever experience of despair, of anguish, of the affliction of their own souls that they have brought upon themselves. So many of us bring those afflictions or kinds of anguish upon ourselves when we push back against the source of hope, who is Jesus Christ. Adam and Eve were banished from that perfect paradise, which was the cause of their need and their desperate pursuit of hope. Think of their first children, which is a picture of all humanity. Cain and Abel, their first two sons. Even though they were born into exile outside of that perfect paradise, they had the good things that God provided. Yes, they had to work hard for those things, but they had them. And there came a day when Cain became envious of Abel, who was a type of Christ. Cain decided what he needed to do was to murder his brother and then to bury his body in the dirt. When God confronted him and said, "Where is your brother?" Fortunately, that was not the end of the story, because after the death of Abel, Adam and Eve had another son, and his name was Seth. And he, in one way, in a typological way, was the new source of hope, because he was the line of God, the godly line. He was the line from which Christ would eventually emerge, that Messiah of hope. We, over the days, will explore more about this idea of the Messiah and how he came into the world to bring hope. Not only hope, but also joy, love, and peace, and all the things that we yearn for because of the rebellion of Adam and Eve, and because of the typological murder of Abel by Cain. Look to God for hope. He is there. He will provide hope through Christ. Happy Advent, Day 5. How are you?